Hello, dear Marco and everyone at S.a.L.E Docs. My name is Charles Esche, and I work in the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, amongst a few other things. Um, Firstly, I'd like to say how much of a pleasure it is to join you, albeit in this very limited way. And it's always a pleasure to join in events at S.a.L.E Docs. I think that it's one of the places that, in a way, defines for me my experience of the Biennale every 2 years or year, even with the Architecture Biennale, and a place that I think is full for me of a memory of that event being in Venice, and in a way that's what I wanted to talk about with you in relationship to Biennales and the post-Corona time, or the existing Corona time. I was thinking, Marco asked me to reflect a little bit on curating exhibitions beyond Western Europe, Western Central Europe, let's say, and to see what relevance that might have for the future of the Venice Biennale. I think that what I always have understood from the Venice Biennale, I think in my lifetime anyway, but certainly since 1989, is that it has stuck to a particular model of artistic expression based on the nation states that to some extent, or in different ways, has been challenged. Initially, I think, by the idea of internationalism in art coming from a communist and socialist agenda, but later coming from a very strong capitalist agenda through globalization post 1989. But yet the Venice Biennale, uniquely I think now amongst such big international art events, has stuck to this national definition. And I thought, that's obviously, and I'm not going to rehearse the reasons for that at all. I'm sure you're going to discuss it. But it's not necessarily the most interesting aspect of the Venice Biennale, even if it is the most defining one, to still have these national pavilions, and also to say that it's a wonderful financial model, because it means that Venice itself doesn't have to pay for them, which is a contrast to all other biennales. And also it's a model which is remarkably successful, because what you see is that more and more states want to join in and want to be represented there. So before we're too quick in condemning that national model, we can see it as having two very strong advantages, which I think makes it difficult to change. But what I was thinking further was, what are the characteristics of those other biennales, those non-European biennales, let's say, or non-Western Central European biennales, that we could think about as being useful to import, or at least to think about in relationship to the Venice experience. And I have basically four of them, although I think they're very linked. One is a question of locatedness. I think the most biennales, whether it's Havana or Sao Paulo or Gwangju, projects that were done even in the 70s in Baghdad and Delhi, onto Jakarta and Istanbul, many of which I've been personally involved in and have curated, that those exhibitions, those projects, because they were wider than just a single exhibition in many cases, were really about allowing the art scene, but also maybe the cultural field more generally of a particular place, to stake a claim within the international art system. So that's also commercial evidence for it, but also within the international art discourse, to say that we belong here and we have a right to state our opinions and to be part of your thinking, international art world, however we define that. So in order to do that, they needed to be, and they have been, and in the best examples I think have always been, very located, in the sense that they've come from a particular place and they've told a story about a particular place, and told that story in ways that have revealed darker and lighter sides, historical and present and even future conditions. So locatedness has been a strength that the biennales have used, and that can be through the architectural structures which are used to house the exhibitions, through to the social and political conditions which are being worked on. Now, if locatedness is one aspect of it, I think the other is that they have, in their best examples, these non-Western European biennales, have been driven by a shared artistic and curatorial idea, even agenda, yeah? Even ideology, we could say. An attempt to express something which goes beyond the individual artist and the idea that these works are good and these works are bad, and much more towards saying there is something emerging, whether that's globalization, whether that's a response to particular social conditions, whether it's a response to particular aesthetic conditions or aesthetic developments, where it's a response to particular movements in society, such as feminism or the decolonial discourse that we have surrounding us today. Those have been the most successful biennales because they've united a curatorial and artistic agenda. The third aspect, I think, is their responsiveness. It's related to locatedness, but responsiveness, or even responsibility, the ability to respond, is something which I think the best biennales have. They have a response to ongoing conditions in the world or in the place, but often those are related, that the art world can not only comment on but participate in discussions. Whether they're direct campaigns against social injustices, for instance, or their more general fears of technology, or fears of the invasion of privacy, or fears of breakdown of certain social structures on which communities depend. That ability to respond is something that marks biennales out from, say, museums or other kinds of institutions because of the timescale in which they work on. And finally, and this is maybe a little bit utopian, but I think the best biennales have made something possible which wasn't possible before. What I mean by that is simply that they've allowed art and culture, and maybe more generally our public discourse, to shift from what existed before it to what existed after it. I could give examples of all of these, but I think that would take me far longer than my 5 minutes allocated time, which I'm already straying over. But what I think is interesting to think about is how could the Venice Biennale address locatedness, responsiveness, responsibility, the idea of allowing a shared artistic and curatorial agenda to take center stage and to make something possible that wasn't possible before. How could the structures of the Venice Biennale allow that today? And perhaps that raises the questions which I'm not sure that I could answer. But certainly in relation to locatedness and responsiveness, the interesting thing about the discussion that Venice is having with itself around tourism, around the dependency on visitors from far and wide, rather than dependency on homegrown initiatives, is to what extent the Biennale can address that in itself. Can it become located and responsible to the agendas of Venice again? Or is it always going to be, which it has seemed to me in my lifetime going to the Biennale anyway, as being something that has, in a sense, used Venice as a backdrop, as a literally in a theatrical setting, a backdrop on which another play is played in a way in the front, where the antiquity in a way of Venice is played out against the modernity of the Biennale. Now, I think, as we all know, modernity is our antiquity today. So the Venice Biennale is to some extent an antique in its own right. How could Venice re-enter that stage? How could each country's contributions, if we keep to the nation-state model which is so successful, how could they be or take the responsibility for Venice onto their shoulders? And how could they make something possible in Venice? Perhaps resisting tourism by allowing developments in the place itself to flower, to flourish from the Biennale, to take place. And in the end, is it possible that another Venice could emerge from the initiatives of the artists and the curators involved in the Biennale? I think that would be the ambition. How to do it is something I can't deal with here. I'd have a couple of ideas, but I think they would require really quite major structural change. And clearly, Western Europe, countries like Italy or the Netherlands, where I work, have been very reluctant to make structural change in the last 30 years. They were told that it was the end of history. They were told that they'd won the Cold War. And we haven't really revised our opinions very much since then, although we know that they're no longer true. So that revision is coming, no doubt. The end of the neoliberal era is in sight, but we're not yet there. And the process that we are going to need to get there is also not so clear. But can the Venice Biennale, as it has done in the past, respond to that new agenda? And can it become once more meaningful for Venice? And in doing so, I think, become more meaningful for all of us. I hope that's useful. Thank you very much, and enjoy the conversation. Goodbye.